My ex-husband Julian and his new wife Clara were practically sweating through their designer clothes in the massive glass boardroom. They were entirely bankrupt, millions in debt, and waiting for the anonymous chairman of Vanguard Holdings to sign their bailout papers. When the chairman gets here, you smile and agree to whatever she wants, Julian hissed at Clara, straightening his tie for the fourth time in a minute. Our entire lives depend on this. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. I walked into the room wearing a $10,000 tailored suit, flanked by 5 corporate lawyers, my heels landing on the marble floor with a rhythm that made every person at that table straighten in their chairs. Julian dropped his luxury pen. Clara let out a small, terrified squeal, backing her chair into the wall behind her, like the glass might part, and let her escape through it. I sat down at the head of the table, looked at the man who had left me bleeding on a basement floor a year ago, and let myself smile. "Hello, Julian," I said, quiet enough that he had to lean forward to catch it. "I refused your bailout request," I said, "and I've decided." I let the silence hold for exactly as long as it needed to. "I'm not going to save your company," I said. "I'm going to buy it, fire you, and collect your debts." To understand how a man who once threw divorce papers at my face ended up begging me for his financial life, I have to take you back 3 years. Back to the day I still believed marrying him meant I mattered. I was 22 when I married Julian. And I want to be honest about something before I tell you what happened after. I actually believed he loved me. I understand now, with 3 years of hindsight and a great deal of pain, that I was never the woman Julian wanted. I was the woman Julian needed, for a very specific, very cynical reason. Clara, his childhood sweetheart, was already married to someone else at the time, and a man in Julian's social circle chasing another man's wife openly would have destroyed the family's carefully polished reputation. So he married me instead, a convenient, presentable wife to keep the media occupied while he waited for Clara's marriage to fall apart. I didn't know any of that on our wedding day. I found it out slowly, in pieces over 3 years that felt less like a marriage and more like a sentence I hadn't been told the length of. The moment the ink dried on our marriage certificate, his family moved me into the basement, not figuratively, literally. A damp, unfinished room with a mattress on the concrete floor and a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, while Julian kept the master bedroom for himself, alone, waiting. I became their unpaid maid within the first month, cooking 3 meals a day for a family of 6, cleaning a house large enough to require actual staff, which they'd conveniently let go the week I moved in, because why pay someone when you already had a wife who wouldn't dare complain? Julian's mother, Vivian, ran that house like a private tyranny, and I existed somewhere below the household staff she'd fired and above nothing at all. "You're lucky we let you stay," she told me once, watching me scrub a stain out of the dining room carpet on my hands and knees. "A girl like you, from where you came from, you should be grateful we didn't throw you out already." I didn't argue. I'd learned within the first few months that arguing only made the punishments creative. I slept on that damp mattress every single night for 3 years, listening to Julian's footsteps upstairs, sometimes hearing him on the phone late at night, his voice softening into something I'd never once heard him use with me, a name I came to recognize before I ever met the woman it belonged to, Elara. Clara's divorce finalized in the spring of my 30th. I remember the exact day because the entire house changed overnight. Julian started smiling at breakfast. Vivian started talking openly at dinner about how things were finally about to be corrected, as if I was an error in a spreadsheet waiting to be deleted with a single keystroke. "She needs your title," Vivian told me directly one afternoon while I was folding laundry that wasn't mine in a basket that had never once been mine either. "Clara can't simply become his mistress. She needs to be his wife, which means you need to disappear." "I haven't done anything wrong," I said. Quiet, because quiet was the only volume that had ever kept me safe in that house. "I've given this family 3 years." "You've given this family exactly nothing," Vivian said. "You've been furniture with a pulse. Don't confuse that with contribution." I didn't respond to that. I went back to folding. I didn't yet know how far she was willing to go to finish what she'd started. The letters appeared in my room 11 days later, handwritten, tucked under the mattress where anyone searching would conveniently find them, describing an affair with a man I had never once met. Using details of a life I hadn't lived, Vivian found them herself, loudly. in front of the entire family at dinner, holding them up like evidence at a trial she'd already decided the verdict for. She's been sleeping around this entire time, Ravine announced, voice climbing into a performance clearly meant for an audience larger than the room actually held, behind Julian's back in his own house while he's provided for her for 3 years. I've never seen those letters in my life, I said, and heard my own voice shake with something that wasn't fear anymore, something closer to disbelief at how carefully this had all been arranged. I don't know who wrote them, but it wasn't me. Get out, Julian said, not even looking up from his plate. Pack your things. Julian, please, you have to believe me. These are fake. Someone planted them. I would never. I don't want to hear it, he said. Elara warned me you'd try something like this once you realized what was coming. I want to tell you I fought harder in that moment. I didn't. I was exhausted in a way that went past physical tiredness. 3 years of quiet obedience, finally hitting a wall as if no strength left to climb over. I turned toward the stairs instead, toward the basement, needing somewhere to sit and breathe before I figured out what came next. Vivian followed me to the top of the staircase. You disgust me, she said, close behind me, her voice dropping low enough that only I could hear it. 3 years of feeding you, housing you, and this is how you repay us. A whore in my son's own house. I'm pregnant, I said. I haven't meant to say it like that, in the middle of that specific fury. It came out because I was desperate, because some part of me still believed that fact alone might stop whatever was about to happen. I watched something shift in Vivian's face, not softness. Calculation. Elara won't marry him if there's a child, she said, almost to herself, working through it in real time. She told him that explicitly. No child from the basement rat. I felt her hands on my shoulders before I understood what was happening. It wasn't an accident, whatever story got told about it later. It was deliberate, timed, aimed at the exact moment I had no way to catch myself. I don't remember most of the fall itself. I remember the impact of the first few steps, sharp and disorienting, and then a blinding, tearing pain low in my abdomen that eclipsed everything else, and then the cold hardness of the basement floor beneath me and warmth spreading somewhere I didn't want to look up directly. I lay there, unable to move, unable to fully process what my body was telling me, and screamed for someone, anyone, to call an ambulance. Julian came to the top of the stairs. He looked down at me. I remember his face with a clarity I wish I didn't still have because there was no shock in it. No horror at finding his pregnant wife bleeding on a basement floor. There was relief. Julian, I sobbed. Like, Julian, please, call an ambulance. Something's wrong. I think I'm losing the baby. Please. He didn't move for a long moment. Then he walked down the stairs, slow, unhurried, and I actually let myself believe for one desperate second that he was coming to help me. He crouched down, not to check on me, to pick up a crumpled piece of paper from beside my head, one that must have fallen from his hand somewhere in the last few minutes, and I realized through the pain that it was already a divorce document, already prepared, already waiting for exactly this moment. He tossed it directly into a muddy puddle forming beside me from something that had spilled, or leaked, or bled. "Sign it," he sneered, looking at me like I was garbage on his shoe. "You were never anything but a pathetic shadow to blind the media. My childhood sweetheart is officially divorced now, which means your value to this family is absolute zero. Julian, I'm bleeding. I need a hospital, please. The baby, there is no baby anymore," he said, and something in the flatness of his voice told me, even through the agony, that he already knew that with a certainty he shouldn't have had yet. "There's just you, and you're done here." An ambulance eventually came, called by a neighbor who'd heard the screaming through a basement window, not by anyone inside that house. I lost the baby in the back of that ambulance, somewhere between the driveway and the hospital. Alone, surrounded by paramedics I'd never met, instead of a family who'd had 3 years to become one. I was discharged 4 days later with nothing. No car, no money, arranging, no phone, because Julian had already cancelled the plan the day after the fall, calling it an unnecessary expense to a family lawyer, who apparently found nothing strange about cutting off a woman who just lost her child. I stood outside that hospital in the rain, in a cardigan a nurse had given me because I had nothing warmer, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful underneath the devastation, that there was nothing left in that house or that marriage worth going back for. I found a park bench 2 blocks from the hospital. Sat down in the rain because standing hurt too much and walking further wasn't an option yet. I stayed there for a long time, cold soaking through everything, grief sitting in my chest like something with actual physical weight. And somewhere in that stillness, something in me hardened. Not broken. I want to be precise about that, the same way I've had to be precise about it every single day since. Broken implies something that stops working. What happened to me on that bench was closer to the opposite. Something in me finally, fully stopped bending toward a family that had never once bent toward me. I thought about the life I'd walked away from 4 years earlier, the name I hadn't used since, the family I'd hidden from, not because they were cruel, but because they were enormous, suffocating in an entirely different way. And I'd wanted once to be loved for something other than what I could provide. Julian had never known who I really was. That had been the point once. A quiet life, an ordinary name, a chance to be chosen for herself instead of her family's fortune. I understood, sitting on that bench, that the experiment was over. I pulled a folded, water-damaged card from the inside pocket of my cardigan, the one I'd carried unused for 4 years, a single phone number written on it in my own handwriting. My hands were shaking from cold, from grief, from something colder and steadier underneath both. I dialed it anyway. It rang twice. "This is the private line for the chairman's office," a familiar voice answered, careful, formal, exactly as trained as I remembered. "Who was calling?" "Victor," I said, and felt my own voice come out different than it had in 3 years, steadier, older, closer to the woman I'd been before I buried her. "It's Elara. I need you to come get me." There was a long pause on the other end. "Miss Messian Vanguard," Victor said, and something in his voice cracked with an emotion I hadn't expected, relief so old it sounded almost like grief itself. "We have been looking for you for 4 years." "I know," I said. "I'm ready to come home now." "Where are you?" he said. Already I could hear it, moving, giving orders to someone else in the room with him. I give him the address. The park, bench, the rain. "Don't move," Victor said. "We're coming." I sat there in the rain, waiting, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel like furniture with a pulse. I felt like myself again. 20 minutes later, headlights cut through the rain at the end of the block. Then more. A fleet of 6 blacked-out Rolls-Royces pulled slowly up to the curb, beside that muddy park bench, doors opening in perfect practiced unison, and I understood, watching them arrive, that the version of me who let people push her downstairs and call it nothing had just been left behind on that bench, exactly where she belonged. The Vanguard estate felt like a foreign country for the first several weeks. Not because it had changed, because I had. I'd left that house 4 years earlier, as a 21-year-old desperate to prove she could be loved for something other than a family name attached to 11 zeros. I came back as a woman who had spent 3 years sleeping on a basement mattress. And something about the contrast between those two lives made the marble floors and the private staff feel almost unreal, like a set I'd been handed instead of a home I'd grown up in. Victor didn't ask me questions the first week. He simply managed everything around me with the quiet, terrifying efficiency I remembered from childhood, arranging a private physician, a nutritionist, a grief counselor I actually used more than once because I'd learned enough in that basement to know pretending I was fine wasn't strength, it was just delay. "Take whatever time you need," he told me. The second week, setting a folder of company briefings on the table beside me that I hadn't asked for and hadn't yet touched. Vanguard just runs smoothly under the board's temporary stewardship. There's no urgency. "There's urgency," I said. I just needed to heal enough to use it. I opened the folder that same afternoon. It took 4 months before I felt like myself again in any complete sense. Physical recovery came faster than the rest of it. The reef I learned doesn't follow a schedule a physician can chart for you. I stepped into the chairman's role formally at the start of the 5th month, in a boardroom full of executives who had managed the company competently in my absence, and now watched with a mixture of relief and open curiosity as the sole heir finally reclaimed the seat that had been waiting for her. I didn't tell them where I'd been. I told them I'd needed time, privately for personal reasons, and left it there, and the board wisely didn't push. I rebuilt myself and that boardroom the way I imagined soldiers rebuild themselves after long deployments, piece by piece, competence returning faster than confidence, confidence returning faster than trust. By the 6th month, I was running board meetings the way I remembered my father running them, decisive, unhurried, absolutely certain of every number in front of me, I hadn't thought about Julian in weeks some days. Then, on a Tuesday in the 7th month, his name crossed my desk in a briefing that had nothing to do with him personally, and everything in me went very still. Vanguard Holdings, among its many other functions, maintained a private intelligence division that monitored major corporate accounts for acquisition opportunities, risk exposure, and industry shifts. It was standard practice, nothing personal, the kind of routine surveillance that large conglomerates run on companies within their orbit. The Julian's company, a mid-sized architecture and development firm his family had run for 2 generations, appeared on a routine risk report flagged for declining liquidity. I almost skipped past it. I want to be honest about that. Some part of me, even months into becoming this new, colder version of myself, still didn't want to spend any more of my attention on him than I had to. Then I saw the projected insolvency timeline, and something in me leaned forward instead of the way. Pull everything you have on this company, I told Victor. Full forensic audit. I want to know exactly why they're bleeding money. May I ask why this particular firm, Victor said, though I suspected from the careful neutrality in his voice that he already knew. Because I used to be married to the man who runs it, I said. Victor didn't react visibly. He simply nodded and had the full audit on my desk within a week. What the audit found took my breath away, then not from grief this time. The Julian's company hadn't collapsed due to market conditions or poor leadership decisions or any of the ordinary reasons companies falter. It had collapsed because Julian had been systematically embezzling from his own investors for over 2 years, wiring money through a network of shell accounts that eventually, always, traced back to purchases for Clara. The superyacht, registered under an offshore holding company, purchased 18 months earlier for $4.2 million. A diamond engagement ring custom-designed, insured for $800,000, purchased the same month Clara's divorce finalized. The renovations to a Hamptons property, a private jet lease, dozens of smaller luxury purchases scattered across 2 years, all funded by investor capital that had been earmarked on paper for legitimate development projects that had quietly stalled or never actually broken ground. $30 million total, siphoned out of his own company to fund a life he was building on top of the woman he'd left bleeding in a basement, while I slept on a damp mattress 2 floors below him, unpaid, unacknowledged, treated as a burden his family could barely afford to feed. I sat with that number for a long time. There was one more document buried in that audit, one I almost missed because it wasn't financial at all, just a footnote Victor's investigative team had pulled from an internal company email server as part of the routine forensic sweep. An email from Clara to Julian, dated 3 weeks before the staircase. I won't repeat every line of it. I'll tell you what it said in substance, because the substance is what mattered. Clara had told him explicitly in writing that she would not marry him if there was any possibility of a child from his current marriage, that a baby would complicate everything, publicly and legally, and that he needed to make sure, whatever it took, that his current situation resolved cleanly before her own divorce finalized. I read the email 4 times. Then I understood something I hadn't let myself fully consider until that exact moment. Sitting alone in my office, with a forensic report open on my desk, Julian hadn't simply failed to help me on that staircase. He had known I was pregnant weeks before the fall because I'd told him myself quietly, hopefully, the same week Clara sent that email. And he had said nothing to stop what happened next. He had, if I was reading the timeline correctly, provoked his mother's rage that specific day, knowing precisely what she was capable of when properly triggered. He hadn't just let it happen. He had orchestrated it. I didn't cry over that discovery. I'd cried enough, over enough months, to have run out of a certain kind of tears entirely. What I felt instead was colder, cleaner, the specific stillness of a decision finally being made without any remaining doubt attached to it. "Victor," I said into the intercom. "Yes, Miss Vanguard. I want every piece of Julian's outstanding debt. All of it. Every loan, every credit line, every investor obligation his company currently owes. Buy it. Quietly. I don't want his name anywhere near mine on any of the paperwork until I decide it's time. That will take approximately 6 weeks to fully consolidate," Victor said. "May I ask what the end game is?" "He's going to come to us for a bailout eventually," I said. "His liquidity crisis isn't slowing down, and men like Julian don't know how to ask for help from anyone smaller than themselves. When he does come, I want to already own every single dollar he owes. It took closer to 7 weeks. In the end, we hid carefully enough that no financial journalist or competitor picked up on the pattern of a single conglomerate quietly absorbing every outstanding obligation tied to one struggling architecture firm. By the time it was finished, Vanguard Holdings owned 100% of Julian's company's debt, every loan, every defaulted investor obligation, every predatory credit line his company had taken out in increasing desperation over the last several months, trying to cover the hole his embezzlement had left behind. So his company formally applied for an emergency bailout from Vanguard Holdings 4 days later, submitted through his firm's investment bank, entirely unaware of who actually sat at the head of the conglomerate they were begging. The application landed on my desk that same afternoon. I read through it slowly. His projected numbers, his desperate, almost pleading executive summary about market volatility and unprecedented economic headwinds, carefully omitting any mention of the $30 million he'd personally stolen to fund a super yacht and the dollars he'd personally stolen sovereign ring. I approved a meeting, not a bailout, a meeting. I had Victor's office schedule it for the following Tuesday in the main boardroom at the top floor of the Vanguard Tower, with instructions that the chairman would attend personally, identity to be revealed only upon arrival. I heard later, secondhand, exactly how that instruction landed on Julian's side of things. Excitement, relief, Julian telling Clara in the car on the way over that this was exactly the kind of last-minute miracle their lives had been desperately missing. They drove to the Vanguard Tower that Tuesday morning, dressed in their best clothes, practicing gratitude in the mirror, genuinely believing they were about to be saved. They had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them at the top of that building. The elevator opened directly into the boardroom. That was intentional. I'd asked Victor to arrange the meeting specifically in the room that required arriving through that particular set of doors, because I wanted the first thing Julian and Clara saw when they looked up to be me, already seated, already at the head of a table that belonged entirely to me, with nowhere comfortable for either of them to look instead. I could see them through the glass wall as the elevator rose. Julian, adjusting his tie, rehearsing something with his lips moving slightly. Clara, checking her reflection in the polished surface of her compact mirror, satisfied with what she found there. Two people dressed for an audience they thought they already understood. The doors opened. I watched Julian's eyes find my face before his brain fully processed what his eyes were reporting back. The fraction of a second where recognition existed, but meaning hadn't yet arrived. Then both landed simultaneously, and the color left his face so completely and so fast that Clara, watching him, turned to look at what had done it before she'd even registered the sound of my heels on the floor. Clara made a sound I can only describe as involuntary. The compact mirror hit the table edge and clattered to the floor, and she backed her chair into the glass wall behind her, trying instinctively to put distance between herself and something she understood immediately was not going to be managed, the way most things in her life had been managed. I sat down at the head of the table, folded my hands in front of me, let both of them experience the silence for exactly as long as it needed to run before either could force words through it. "Hello, Julian," I said. Quiet, the way I'd rehearsed it, though in the end it didn't feel like a rehearsal at all. "You look well." He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Elara," he finally said, and the name came out strange, uncertain, like a word in a language he'd forgotten he once spoke. "What? You're... how are you?" "The chairman of Vanguard Holdings," I said helpfully, "which is the entity currently holding 100% of your company's outstanding debt. Every loan, every defaulted investor obligation, every credit line your firm has taken out in the last 18 months while you were embezzling $30 million from your own investors to buy your new wife a super yacht." Clara made the involuntary sound again. "That's not Julian started. I have the wire transfer records," I said. "All of them. The forensic accounting team at Vanguard has been working on your books for 3 months. I also have the emails, Julian, including the one Clara sent you 3 weeks before your mother pushed me down the stairs." The silence in that room became a different kind of silence after that. Heavier, the kind that comes not from an absence of things to say, but from a sudden, total understanding that nothing left to say is going to help. "You knew I was pregnant," I said, keeping my voice level with the specific effort of someone who has practiced this exact moment many times in private and still finds it requiring effort. "Clara told you she wouldn't marry you if there was a child in the picture. And you provoked your mother 3 days later, deliberately, because you knew exactly what she would do with a filling of rage and a staircase nearby." Julian didn't deny it. That was the thing I braced for and didn't need to in the end. I simply sat there looking at a point somewhere below my face, and the absence of denial was its own kind of confession. I lost our child on the floor of your basement, I said, and you stepped over me to hand her your car keys. Elara, I'm not finished, I said. Not loud. I didn't need loud. I slid the documents across the table, not all at once. Not in a theatrical cascade, just one folder, set precisely in front of him, the kind of gesture that communicates that there are more where that came from, and the pace is entirely mine to control. Vanguard Holdings is formally executing a hostile takeover of your company, I said, while Julian's hands opened the folder with a specific mechanical movement of a man whose higher functions have temporarily suspended. As the primary debt holder, we have the legal standing to do so, and the paperwork is already filed. As of 9 o'clock this morning, I own your company. All of it. Julian looked up from the documents. You can't. The second document, I said, is your termination of employment, effective immediately. You no longer work there in any capacity, including as CEO, which was the title you gave yourself when your father's name was still keeping the lights on. The third document, I continued, sliding another folder toward Clara, who had not moved or spoken since her compact mirror hit the floor, is a court-ordered asset seizure covering all purchases made with embezzled investor funds. That includes the super yacht, currently docked in Monaco, the engagement ring, the Hamptons property renovations, the private jet lease. All of it will be liquidated to partially offset the $30 million your husband stole from people who trusted him with their money. Clara's hand went to her left hand, to the ring. The $800,000 ring, custom designed, purchased with stolen money. You'll need to leave that here, I said. This is mine, Clara said, the first word she'd spoken in the room, her voice coming out smaller than I suspected she intended. He gave it to me. He gave you something that belonged to his investors, I said, which makes it mine now, actually, since I bought their claims. Leave it on the table when you go. The door at the far end of the boardroom opened 20 minutes into the meeting, and I want to be precise about the timing. It had mattered, I had known, since the meeting was scheduled, that Vivian would come eventually. Women like Vivian don't sit quietly at home while their financial lifelines are being cut. They come to fight loudly in lobbies and boardrooms because volume and certainty have always been the only tools they've needed. She made it as far as the receptionist's desk on the executive floor before Victor had security meet her. I heard her voice through the glass before I saw her. The same voice I'd heard at the top of a staircase telling me I disgusted her. "But get your hands off me!" she was shouting, at a volume clearly designed to carry, clearly designed to make everyone in the surrounding offices understand that she was a person of sufficient importance that her displeasure should register as an event. "Do you know who I am? I will have every single one of you fired by the end of today." The boardroom doors opened. 2 police officers entered, followed by Victor, followed by Vivian, who was only not in handcuffs yet because the officers were giving her the dignity of walking under her own power to the moment where those would become necessary. "Vivian Hardwell," one of the officers said, "you're under arrest for aggravated assault causing grievous bodily harm." Vivian stopped, looked at the officers, looked at the boardroom, looked finally at me, and I watched the exact sequence of emotions cross her face. Confusion first, then fury, then finally something that might have been the first genuine fear she'd felt in a very long time. "We recovered the hallway security footage from your family home," I said, from my seat at the head of the table. "You had it deleted from the main server. You didn't know my team was going to look for the backup stored in the router cache." "That was an accident," Vivian said, her voice dropping from its performance volume to something tighter, more controlled. She lost her footing. I barely touched. The footage shows something different, I said. 2 hands, placed deliberately, and a push timed to the exact moment I had nowhere to grab onto. Though my private physician's medical records from that day are also on file, documenting the nature of the injuries and the timeline of the pregnancy loss. Vivian looked at Julian. Julian looked at his shoes. "Don't," Vivian said to him, her voice dropping into something that was almost a hiss. "Don't you dare say a single, 'Take her out, please,'" I said to the officers. Calm, the way I'd ask someone to close a window. They took her out. The room, after she left, felt measurably quieter. I looked back at Julian and Clara. Clara had taken the ring off at some point in the last few minutes and set it on the table, not dramatically, just quietly. The way you set something down when you finally accept it, you don't get to keep it. There's one more document, I said. Victor placed it on the table from his position behind me. A thicker folder than the others, and Julian picked it up with the wariness of a man who has stopped expecting good news from paper. That's an employment contract, I said. Both of you. I have full-time, minimum-wage janitorial position at this building beginning next Monday. Duration of employment tied directly to the repayment schedule on your outstanding debt, which, at minimum wage with standard deductions, should take approximately 11 years. Clara looked up from the contract. You're joking. I don't joke in boardrooms, I said. The alternative is a federal embezzlement prosecution, which I am legally obligated to report regardless of your cooperation, but which I have some discretion over in terms of additional civil cooperation. Sign the contract, and my legal team will submit a statement of partial cooperation to the federal prosecutor's office. Don't sign it, and you'll have the full weight of that proceeding without it. You can't make us scrub floors, Julian said, and his voice cracked in the last word in a way that I suspect surprised even him. I'm not making you do anything, I said. I'm offering you an option. You're welcome to choose the alternative. He signed it. Clara signed it 4 minutes after he did, after sitting completely still and staring at the document without reading it, in the particular posture of someone calculating whether there is any remaining exit they haven't already tried. There wasn't. The mother-in-law received 3 years in prison for the staircase assault, later increased to 5 on appeal when the full forensic medical record was admitted. She cried in the courtroom, loudly, the performance of someone who had spent a lifetime having their tears treated as events of significance. The judge looked unimpressed. Julian's federal embezzlement case proceeded separately, running alongside his employment contract, his lawyer managing a negotiated plea that kept him out of prison in exchange for fuller cooperation, and the civil judgment that put him in blue overalls 5 days a week instead. Clara's assets were liquidated within 6 weeks. The yacht sold at auction. The ring returned to the insurer's registry it had been fraudulently claimed against. The Hamptons property stripped of its legal renovations and transferred back into the investor recovery fund. She kept the apartment she'd had before Julian, a 1-bedroom in a neighborhood several tax brackets below where she'd spent the last year living, and took the bus to work the first Monday in the blue uniform, arriving 8 minutes late because she'd apparently never had to navigate public transit from that part of the city before. I noted the tardiness in the employee file. Said nothing directly. Let it accumulate the way all things accumulate when someone finally has no one powerful enough to smooth the records behind them. I was 3 weeks into the new arrangement. On a Thursday morning, crossing the lobby with a coffee I picked up from the building's cafe, rather than waiting for it to be brought to me, because I'd never fully readopted certain habits of the extremely wealthy, even after coming home. I heard them before I saw them. A mop hitting a wet floor sign, the particular sound of industrial cleaning equipment being used by someone who hadn't grown up learning how it worked. Sir Julian was on his hands and knees near the far end of the lobby, working at a section of the marble floor near the main entrance, his blue uniform already damp at the knees from whatever he'd been doing for the last hour. Clara was somewhere near the planters, running a polishing cloth along the brass fittings with the distant, mechanically miserable expression of someone who has accepted a reality they cannot yet articulate to themselves. I stopped. I looked at the section of floor Julian was working on. Then I looked at my coffee. Then, very deliberately, I tapped it slightly, sending a clean stream of it across 3 feet of recently polished marble. Julian looked up. I looked down at him, and at the spreading stain on the marble, and at the mop sitting 2 feet from his right hand. "Mr. Spot," I said. I turned toward the private elevator, hit my floor without looking back. The doors closed. I rode up alone 42 floors in silence, to an office and an empire and a life that belonged entirely, finally, completely to me. I thought briefly about a park bench in the rain and a cardigan donated by a nurse and $63 folded into a borrowed pocket. I thought about a damp basement and a ceiling bulb and a mattress on a concrete floor. I thought about a staircase. Then the elevator opened and I stepped out into my own light and I got back to work.